less than $10,000 a year. Now, I know that many of you are grant seekers, and I'm going to assume that each of you is also a donor, no matter how small the amount you give annually. If it's less than $10,000 a year, you probably can't run your own program or transform an organization, but you can maximize the impact of your donation if you're smart about your giving. And today I'm going to talk about 5 ways you can do this. This workshop's going to be a little different from all the others so far. You're not going to see my face much, but after each section, I'll try to answer some of your chat box questions. So if you're ready, let's start with the first slide. We're going to look at 5 ways you can make a difference through a mix of videos and slides taken from a 3-hour virtual course that I've developed for need that will be available this fall. At the heart of this course is the Smart Donor Workbook, which participants fill out as they go along. And at the end, they have a personal roadmap for their giving. There's a link in the chat box now, and the workbook is also available in the resource library. Unfortunately, today we won't have time for you to fill out your workbook during the workshops, but at the end of each section, I'll point out which pages apply. But first, let me get a sense of who you are by asking you to go to the poll tab and fill out a quick poll with just 2 questions. While the answers are being analyzed, I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. I'm half French, half American, and I spent 25 years working in different aspects of international development, from project finance on Wall Street to running a microfinance program on the Pakistan-Afghan border to fundraising for small international charities. Then in 2007, I took a course on strategic philanthropy that changed my life. But it really bothered me that such a great education was only available to the very wealthy. So I decided that my personal mission would be educating small and mid-sized donors who are usually ignored. And that's why I developed resources specifically for this target audience. All right, let's begin. And let me first, though, give you some of the poll results. It seems that most of you give to a mix of organizations. About 1/3 of you don't give internationally. So I hope that this workshop will give you the confidence to look at some more international giving. And 2/3 of you give less than $10,000 a year, so you are my target audience. But I hope that some of the tips and advice I give you today will also be helpful to the 1/3 of you who give over $10,000 a year. So let's begin. I'd like to start with a quick overview of the international assistance landscape. I know we've been talking about it for the past day and a half, but there are a few important concepts worth highlighting. The first is that until the year 2000 and the Millennium Development Goals, governments provided almost all the funding. As you can see here today, philanthropy still has the smallest share of the approximately $850 billion that flow into low and middle income countries. By far the largest source is remittances, home from 270 million migrants around the world. They support NGOs and community groups in their countries of origin, an increasingly significant phenomenon known as diaspora giving. Second, official development aid from governments, called ODA, is now beginning to come from upper middle income countries. You see here Turkey, China, and Mexico are becoming important players. Third, private international philanthropy is still dominated by the United States, much due single-handedly to the Gates Foundation, and still principally flows to middle-income countries such as India, Nigeria, Mexico, China, or South Africa, not the very poorest. But wealthy donors within these same countries are also increasingly giving locally and across borders. And finally, many people don't understand the chain of intermediaries that their donations go through. Governments principally give to multilateral organizations such as the United Nations and large established intermediaries called international NGOs. 97% of private philanthropy also goes principally to international NGOs. Big international NGOs in turn give to about 300,000 smaller NGOs, international NGOs, based in donor countries, 16,000 in the US alone. And they in turn support several million local NGOs and community groups in low and middle income countries. So most of the funding for the organizations that actually implement programs comes at the end of a long line of intermediaries, each of whom has taken a management fee along the way. And finally, there are the purple stars, the research organizations, the think tanks, the universities, usually based in high-income countries, as well as thousands of consultants providing specialized expertise and services to all these organizations. So the bottom line is that private donations represent a very small part of this picture. However, they can be more flexible and nimble than government or multilaterals or even INGOs, and therefore can make an outsized difference. And you too, as part of that small universe, can leverage your impact by making the right decisions. The way you can do this is by carefully choosing the cause, for example, women and girls, and the issue area or areas you want to support, for example, land rights for women. We're going to watch a short video now on why your choice of issue is so important, and then I'll give you 3 tests to apply to your selection.
The difference between a good and a great use of your money can be huge. In 2013, the philosopher Toby Ord wrote an important article about the differences in cost effectiveness of health initiatives. But what he wrote about health can be applied to any aspect of your giving. Toby Ord's argument goes like this. Suppose you have a $50,000 budget to spend as you wish to fight blindness. One thing you could do is provide a guide dog to a blind person in the US. It costs about $50,000 to train a guide dog and another $1,200 a year for its 8-year working life. The guide dog will hugely improve the blind person's quality of life, but will not cure blindness. Another option is to pay for surgeries to reverse the most debilitating effects of trachoma, the leading infectious cause of blindness worldwide, which affects 80 million people. This costs between $25 and $40 per patient. So would you spend your entire budget on training one single guide dog to help one person overcome the challenges of blindness, or on operating up to 2,000 people? Of course, this example is not applicable to all giving decisions. It does not account for any personal reasons you may have for preferring guide dogs to surgery. And it's usually difficult to make direct apples-to-apples comparisons between the effect of 2 interventions. But it does illustrate the power of your donation. Let's look at another of Toby Ord's examples, again in the health space. In this case, the cost effectiveness of funding 5 types of HIV/AIDS interventions. DALYs stand for Disability Adjusted Life Years, a standard measure in global health. But you don't need to be a scientist to understand this chart if I tell you it's saying that antiretroviral therapy is estimated to be 50 times more effective than treatment of Kaposi sarcoma. that preventing transmission during pregnancy is 5 times more effective than antiretroviral therapy, that condom distribution is about twice as effective as that, and that education of high-risk groups is about twice as effective again. In total, the best of these interventions is estimated to be 1,400 times more cost-effective than the least good. Or stated another way, the least effective HIV/AIDS intervention produces less than 0.1% of the value of the most effective. Now, of course, for the AIDS patient whose pain from Kaposi sarcoma is relieved through surgery, that option is hugely important. You as a donor must weigh this against the benefits of educating many more people in high-risk groups to prevent the need for surgery in the first place. I've used these 2 examples to show you how much more of a difference you can make by investing time and effort to discover the best approaches and the highest performing organizations. The difference.
As you decide which issue or issues you want to support, keep in mind 3 important criteria. These were initially developed by the effective altruism movement, a philosophy and social movement that promotes applying evidence and reason to answer the question, where can I do the most good? The first is scale. I didn't say urgency. Scale is how much good will result from solving this issue. Often, but not always, you can put a number on the amount of good that can be done, the number of people who will benefit, the acres of land that will be preserved. The second criteria is solvability. What are the chances of success? Or said another way, if we doubled the resources dedicated to solving the problem, would that make more than double the difference? And the third test is neglectedness. How many resources are already going to solve the problem? Is the bulk of the funding coming from government or the market? If the cause is already very popular, the marginal difference your donation will make may be less than in another issue area. To illustrate applying these 3 criteria, let's look at the example of water and sanitation, UN Sustainable Development Goal number 6. The issue gets a high score for scale. 1 in 10 people worldwide doesn't have access to sufficient, safe, fresh water. 1 in 4 doesn't have a decent toilet. A newborn dies every minute from infections caused by unsafe water. But this issue scores low for solvability. A large percentage of water projects fail for many reasons, from inappropriate technology to lack of government support. Yet many water charities are not transparent about their success rate. This issue also scores low for neglectedness, as many charities are already working on the problem. Some partner with local organizations to build wells. Others develop and disseminate filtration systems. Some provide loans for communities to hook up to public water systems or for individuals to build latrines. Others work to change government policy. So as a donor interested in this vitally important issue, you need to invest some time in educating yourself to find the right charities using proven approaches, perhaps ones that are not getting as much support as the big names. So now that you've seen this, you can fill out the first 4 pages of the workbook, which you see illustrated here. The second way you can make a significant difference is by carefully selecting the approach you want to support. There are effectively 3 broad pathways to change. Ones that are community-based, in other words, projects and programs to provide direct services. Ones that are policy-based, in other words, to influence government policy or public opinion. And ones that are market-based, in other words, to harness market forces to solve social or environmental issues. Let's look specifically at policy-based solutions, including advocacy and movement building. This is particularly important in low and middle income countries where the government plays an outsized role in development, both as a funder and as a partner.
The majority of charities undertake community-based programs and services, but might supplement their work with policy-based or market-based activities. So let's now look at policy-based solutions meant to change the system. These include influencing government regulation, such as Oxfam working with government ministries in 30 countries to produce strong legal frameworks protecting women's land rights. But awareness raising and communications campaigns are also critically important. In this case, a public interest initiative to educate women about their rights and ability to exercise control over land. However, even the best conceived campaigns can't transform customary laws and social norms rooted in patriarchy. Empowering women to assert their land rights requires building a movement that mobilizes hearts and minds at the community level. The most successful movements can even trickle up to influence government policy, such as in the case of Fambol Talks, community-led reconciliation and development program in Sierra Leone, whose approach was eventually adopted by the government on a national basis. Another example of a collective advocacy initiative working at all levels is Girls Not Brides, a global partnership of more than 1,500 civil society organizations committed to ending child marriage. It pushed for the UN General Assembly to adopt the 4th resolution on child, early, and forced marriages in November 2020. The partnership also works to amplify the voices of community-based organizations in 95 countries by enabling them to share data, evidence, and lessons learned. Indeed, donors interested in advocacy, movement building, and transforming societal mindsets should seek out organizations that work in a spirit of accompaniment with those who know what change is needed. Public awareness campaigns are only effective if the messaging is authentic and rooted in the community. One notable success story is the Bell Bajo, or Ring the Bell, anti-domestic violence campaign in India, where public service announcements urge locals to interrupt acts of domestic violence by ringing doorbells and asking for something simple like a bit of sugar. The campaign had a measurable impact on public attitudes and the number of women seeking legal help. It's now been adapted for China, Pakistan, Vietnam, Brazil, and South Africa. Sometimes the most effective use of donor dollars is supporting charities that provide civil society organizations with networking, infrastructure, legal aid, training, and mentoring. But American donors must be extra careful not to indirectly support political parties, acts of violence, or groups labeled as terrorist by the U.S. government. These material support regulations can make funding peace-building initiatives particularly tricky. Technology has been hugely beneficial to movement building and mindset change, for example, by empowering citizen journalists to fight corruption. But results are still hard to measure, as such change happens slowly. Supporting advocacy, movement building, and societal change, particularly overseas, is not for the faint-hearted. But donors who invest in human rights, peace building, gender equality, LGBTQ+ rights, social justice, indigenous rights, or environmental rights, to name just a few, find their efforts rewarded with impact and meaning.
So now you know enough to fill out page 6 of the workbook. I also want to encourage you, if there's anything that I've said that's unclear, or if you have any questions, to post them in the chat. I can answer them at the end of the next section, or if you prefer to save them to the end, we can also talk about these at that time. So I'll just move on now, but don't hesitate to use the chat box if anything comes to mind. So we now get to the third point, which is understanding impact. And really, that's probably the best thing you can do to improve your impact, is to actually understand what impact really means. Unfortunately, there's huge confusion about the topic of measurement and analysis, and too much complicated vocabulary. So let me use an example. Let's examine a program in Colombia to teach young people emotional skills. How do you know it's working? And after watching this video, we'll look at some of the claims made by well-known charities and see if they're valid. And then we'll end with a video on tips about how to analyze a charity's website.
I've brought you to Colombia because this is a country where social and emotional learning are urgently needed to supplement the traditional school curriculum. Colombia is emerging from 54 years of civil war. Currently, only 1 in 3 youths graduates from high school. Yet it's this post-conflict generation that holds the key to a peaceful and prosperous future. Here's Henry May, who came to Colombia after working in some of England's toughest inner-city schools. He saw that here too, teaching socio-emotional skills could have a dramatic positive effect on students. So in 2013, he launched Co-School. In its first 5 years, Co-School has trained over 15,000 students in 100 public and private schools through a variety of summer camps and after-school programs that run from a day to a year. Today, Co-School is focusing increasingly on teacher training and developing an online course to train the trainers. But is Co-School really transforming lives?
In order to understand the difference that we're making, building a theory of change has been a really important process for Co-School, and I'm going to talk you through it step by step. So the theory of change starts with the mission of the organization. Why are we here? What's our purpose? And the mission of Co-School is to prepare Colombian youth with skills for 21st century employment and well-being. Simple enough, right? The next stage in the theory of change is called activities. And this is the moment when we describe what does the organization do? What are the actions taken to implement their program? And we're going to look at a specific example within Co-School, a leadership program that we ran in 2016 called Co-Lead.
Co-Lead is a 3-day workshop run in collaboration with local businesses to teach young people life skills and problem solving by designing socially responsible startups for their communities.
So we're now into the third stage of the theory of change. And it's important to note that we're now beginning to look at the results of the program. The first 2 stages could be considered more planning. When we start thinking about outputs, what we're really interested in are the simple numbers. How many hours of work did we do? How many workshops did we run? With how many people? Let's see what the outputs were for Co-Lead 2016. So we're now looking at the 4th stage of the theory of change, outcomes. And it's really important to mention that quite often we get confused between outputs and outcomes. In outcomes, we're beginning to look at the difference that our program is really making. We're starting to think about the changes that our work is making in participants. Successful outcomes should be achievable and meaningful for participants. So let's dive into Co-Lead 2016 to see what the outcomes were and to see how we did.
85% of the youth that finish our program Co-Lead report feeling better about themselves, having better relationships, being more able to resolve conflicts, and making better decisions in their lives. This means that as adults, they have a clearer life project and are more able to contribute to Colombian society.
So we're now into the final stage of the theory of change, impact. And we've built a simple 5-step process in order to get there. The impact stage of the theory of change is where we talk about the ultimate difference that we're making, the long-term impact that we are having on the lives of individuals or the environment. Let's hear from our participant of COLI 2016 to see what the change has been in him 3 years after the program.
Okay, so now that you've watched this video and gotten your vocabulary down, let's do some exercises together. I've picked a few web pages from well-known charities, although they will remain anonymous. And I want to look at them with you and see if they are really telling us a story of impact. So I've designed a few questions. Unfortunately, we're not in a room together, so you can't give me your answers, but at least you can decide which answer you'd pick, and then I'll give you a few minutes and I'll tell you the solution. So the first one is easy. In order to deter and apprehend poachers, this program provides training, equipment, and supplemental salaries to wildlife rangers. I'll blow up the results for you, the metrics for you. Have a look at them and decide which metrics measure success. All of them, the first two, or the last two? Well, the correct answer is 3, the last two, because only the last two metrics show outcomes, what has been accomplished by the investment in the program. Ideally, showing a baseline, what would be happening without the existence of the program, would go even further to illustrate success. But these are the two metrics that are really showing you the difference the program is making. Okay, next one. Assume you're a donor wanting to make a difference to the world's 660 million people without access to clean water. You don't have the resources to identify and support well-run, safe water projects overseas, and you hear about a charity that raises about $50 million a year and redistributes $35 million a year to local organizations around the world that build and run sustainable water, sanitation, and hygiene projects. What is the single most important piece of information you need to know about this particular charity before you make a donation? Is it its ability to identify and monitor good partners? Is it the number of wells that get built? Or is it how much money it raises each year? Well, the correct answer is number 1. Because based on its business model, which is raising and redistributing funds to local partners, this charity's success depends entirely on its ability to select good partners. If the charity is keeping 30% of the funds it raises to identify and monitor partners, donors should hear about its ability to undertake this crucial task. Yet, as you can see, there is nothing about that on the website. Charity H is a $2 billion international organization whose mission is seeking to put God's love into action by bringing people together to build homes, communities, and hope. Its theory of change is to help build, renovate, or preserve homes as well as broaden access to affordable housing so that communities will experience positive and lasting social, economic, and spiritual change. So what does this chart actually demonstrate? The effect of better housing on educational outputs, the effects of better housing on educational outcomes, or the effects of better housing on employment prospects. Now you know the difference between outputs and outcomes. So have a look at these numbers and see what you think. Well, the correct answer is 2. It really is showing you, it's an excellent example of how better housing affects educational outcomes. We see the difference that better housing is making. All right, here's the next one. Charity R builds school libraries, publishes and distributes children's books in local languages, trains educators in literacy skills, and collaborates with local governments, schools, communities, and families to promote literacy and girls' education in 10 countries. This page from its website shows impressive outcomes for grade 2 children as compared to their peers in non-Charity R schools. So what's wrong with claiming that increasing childhood literacy will break the cycle of poverty in a single generation? Is it that illiteracy is not the only cause of poverty? Is it a lot can happen between grade 2 and adulthood? Or is it even literate children may drop out of school? Is it the first, the second, or maybe all 3? Well, the correct answer is 3. It's all 3. At first glance, this sweeping statement seems impressive. Charity R's approach is obviously working, but its results should be presented as part of a systems-wide approach to the massively complex problem that is poverty. And finally, one more. Another Charity R provides loans to support smallholder farmer groups in vulnerable communities around the world, as well as training to strengthen their financial management, governance, and agronomic capacity. Its theory of change is that strong, well-funded agricultural enterprises can be engines of impact to raise incomes, create jobs, empower women and young people, sustain peace, and preserve vulnerable ecosystems. The chart above shows activities and outputs specifically relating to female agricultural workers. So outputs. It's much harder to define the outcomes, the measurable success for each woman. What are some outcomes that this charity could give you to satisfy you the program is really an engine of impact? Could it tell you what the growth in average income received by the female farmers is? Could it tell you what improvements in health and education outcomes that these women's children experience as compared to communities that did not receive loans? Or could it give you more detail about the number of female businesses? Well, while all 3 sets of metrics are important, only number 2 shows a noticeable improvement in the quality of life of the women and their families. The number of new businesses launched is unreliable because over 50% of startup microenterprises fail in their first year. So I hope that you see how imprecise and sometimes even misleading websites can be. And it's a little shocking that these major $100 million, billion-dollar charities are not doing a better job explaining the difference they're making. And so to help you be a little more savvy about judging charities, just making your donation decisions, I've put together a little video on the website of an organization which I think has done a particularly good job with their website. And I hope that this will give you a few tips on what to look for the next time you go to a website, because most small and mid-sized donors have to rely on a charity's website for much of the information they need.
How can you tell if a charity is making a difference? There are 5 components to a good response. First, has the charity clearly defined success? Second, is it measuring the right things? Third, is it evaluating its data properly? Fourth, is it learning from the findings? And fifth, is it clearly communicating results to donors? To illustrate how you can answer these questions, let's assume you want to focus on high-impact ways to alleviate poverty. You've learned that bad eyesight is costing the global economy over $277 billion annually in lost productivity. Close to 2.7 billion people around the world who need eyeglasses don't have them, to drive a truck, to read a blackboard, to sew a garment, to pick coffee beans. Eyeglasses are a powerful tool for social and economic development and personal well-being. You do a little research and learn that less than 1% of global health funding goes to solving uncorrected vision. So it's clearly a neglected issue that also ranks high for scale. Yet eyeglasses can correct almost half this global burden. And there seems to be a great opportunity to market a product for people earning under $4 a day. That's a check for solvability. With just a little more research, you come across a New York Times article that mentions the Eye Alliance. You look it up to see who the members are and decide to check out a few of their websites. One is Vision Spring, a $9 million charity that operates in over 20 countries with over 500 partners who are health and eye care providers, NGOs, governments, and corporations. You like this social enterprise business model and the collaborative approach supporting existing distribution networks, so you decide to spend a bit more time on the website. First, you look to see if the charity has a clear path from vision to action. There is an elaborate description of the theory of change on the website, but in a nutshell, Vision Spring believes that eyeglasses improve daily functioning, productivity, and earning potential, creating a greater likelihood of a pathway out of poverty. Vision Spring trains people without formal eye care experience to dispense reading glasses, and also trains its distributors to improve marketing and sales to individuals earning less than $4 a day. Second, you ask, is Vision Spring measuring the right things? Well, output and outcomes are a little jumbled here, but the data is up to date. And there's a summary that clearly shows the progression from output to outcomes to impact. There's also qualitative data that reflects the voices of those served. 3 success stories about increasing productivity and 3 about increasing livelihoods. That's about the right number, because just one moving story is no proof of long-term success. And finally, you need to make sure you're getting long-term results, not short-term ones that fade over time. For example, this chart shows the results of a randomized control trial for a 24-week recovery program to treat 308 previously incarcerated adults with a history of opioid dependency. As you can see, by a year and a half, there's almost no difference with the control group. Yet almost all opioid treatment programs present their results over a year or less. As a donor, you have little way of knowing if you're funding a program with lasting results. In contrast, Vision Spring gives us a timeline of their milestones since their founding. This is also a good way to demonstrate how the organization is scaling up. So in summary, good measuring means precise and thorough measurements that are up to date, a mix of stories and numbers, but not too many, that come directly from those served, outcomes, not just outputs, that use a baseline and are consistent over time. Now let's go to the third criteria, evaluation. Is the charity evaluating its data properly? Vision Spring references rigorous academic studies, notably about the effect of providing free glasses on children's educational outcomes, and a randomized control trial whose results were published in the Lancet Global Health. Both these studies provide a baseline against which to measure success. And finally, Vision Spring has received many awards and endorsements. But do you feel there's enough evidence to make the bold assertion that this organization has generated over $1 billion in economic impact? As a potential donor interested in using market forces to solve social problems, you should focus on how Vision Spring supplements its high-volume, low-margin business model with donations to cover the difference between what NGOs can pay for eyeglasses they distribute and the actual cost of providing eyeglasses to underserved groups. A look at the annual report shows that the charity is still very dependent on donor support. Nevertheless, the potential multiplier effect of a donation is compelling. There's one important topic that's not covered on the website. Vision Spring is heavily reliant on the effectiveness of its partners in distributing eyeglasses. It would be useful to know more about how partners are selected and evaluated. Have any tough lessons been learned? Indeed, criteria number 4 is finding out whether the organization is learning and course correcting. It's great if charities can demonstrate they're contributing to impact, but they also need to act on their findings. Is there some evidence that leads you to believe the organization is thinking critically about its programs and always trying to improve? High-performing charities, no matter what their size, must be problem solvers, or, to use a term you hear a lot in the nonprofit sector, learning organizations. That means they learn from false starts and failures. Yet it's extremely rare to find out from websites or annual reports whether a charity has created a robust culture of learning. Finally, we get to the 5th criteria. Is the organization communicating properly? The best data in the world will not help you make a good giving decision if it's not presented clearly. Well, I wouldn't be showing you the Vision Spring website if I didn't think it did a great job communicating results.
Okay, so once you've finished this section, you could go to your workbook, and I have a theory of change, a guide to establishing your theory of change, and a guide to looking at your short list of organizations you'd like to support and determining whether they fit the criteria that we've just heard about. I'm also going to pause for a second to answer a very interesting question regarding, in particular, the little exercise we did on the anti-poaching charity. And your question brings up a very common issue, which is what do you do when there are no metrics, or when it's really difficult to measure the difference that's being made? And I find that one way to do this is simply to ask the question, what would the situation be if this organization didn't exist, if this program or initiative didn't exist? So you kind of reverse the question. That's one way to, if you don't have good metrics, that's one way to understand if a difference is being made. The person who asked the question was pointing out that there are very few prosecutions in Africa, where most of these wildlife programs are. And so obviously prosecutions is probably not the best metric, and other metrics need to be found, or other ways of other angles to look at the situation to see if a difference is being made. Also, I do encourage you, because I know that all this is extremely dense, if you want to go back and look at these videos again, I believe they will be up for the rest of the month. So let's move now to the next section, which is going to zero in on a particularly effective way to have impact that you've already heard a lot about in the symposium, and that's supporting grassroots organizations. But this is probably also the most difficult thing for a small or mid-sized donor to do. So I've made a little video for you on the role of intermediaries, the organizations that can bridge the distance between you and high-performing grassroots organizations on the other side of the world, to allow you to be proximate to those you want to support, even if you are a small donor.
As we heard in Module 2, almost all humanitarian and development assistance flows through international NGOs, many of which still employ an outside-in approach, identifying problems and solutions with little consultation of the people served. Programs are designed to show high impact quickly, or the funding is pulled. When local organizations are subcontracted to execute programs for international NGOs, who themselves receive funding from governments and multilateral organizations, the rigid budget structures, heavy reporting requirements, and short project cycles cascade all the way down the line. International NGOs tend to be enthusiastic about funding pilots, less so about replication and scaling successful startups. Staff changes mean lost institutional knowledge. So perhaps a better approach is to build the capacity of local leaders and grassroots organizations to define and solve their community's issues, with outsiders providing technical assistance, fundraising support, and networking as requested. Grassroots organizations are uniquely placed to understand systemic problems and offer targeted solutions. They possess the trust, knowledge, and social capital required to effectively serve their communities. With the capacity to solve real-world problems in groups of 100 to 10,000, community organizations can incubate, test, iterate, and prove ideas that can then be taken to scale, particularly in partnership with government entities. And by strengthening the social fabric of a community, grassroots organizations can build a collective voice and demonstrate collective impact to demand more from their governments. Local leaders provide consistency, continuity, and cultural sensitivity to implement sustainable, lasting solutions. And we know that systemic change takes far longer than the usual 5-year grant cycle. And when compared to large international NGOs with high operating costs, grassroots organizations are more efficient with capital because they're embedded in their communities. These organizations have always existed, but until recently they've remained in the shadows, seen as too small or lacking in the formal capacity that global development actors need for rapid impact. For example, less than 2% of international humanitarian aid goes to local organizations in the countries affected by disasters. Only 5% of U.S. foundation giving to Africa goes to African-led organizations. Today, however, donors realize that grassroots organizations are an effective mechanism for impacting hard-to-reach populations in large numbers. but how to provide them with the flexible, unrestricted funding coupled with the appropriate technical expertise and networking they need to grow and thrive. How to balance proposals and reporting requirements to both satisfy the requirements of foreign donors while not overwhelming local leaders, who often feel they're in perpetual survival mode. One small but mighty organization that's tackling this challenge is One World Children's Fund. The story of One World's launch in 2000 is a common one. 3 friends traveling in India were moved to do something upon their return home. But while most heartfelt initiatives of this kind fizzle out after a few years, these founders adopted a more strategic approach by launching a fiscal sponsorship service to grassroots organizations around the world working with children and youth. One World also offers its members a knowledge-sharing network and educational programming on organizational sustainability. Today, its $400,000 annual operating budget is leveraged by 26 community organizations into $2.8 million of revenue from the United States. One World has chosen to grow its membership selectively so it can provide deeper support on topics relevant to all grassroots organizations, such as fiscal responsibility, fundraising, governance, and communications. More and more intermediary organizations are recognizing the catalytic power of supporting grassroots initiatives. Some, like the Global Fund for Children, act like investment funds and channel donations to community groups they've selected and vetted. Others, like Firelight, use donor dollars specifically to build the financial, technical, and organizational capacity of grassroots organizations. Even a very small initiative like WEMA, with a $1.5 million budget focused on water, health, education, and economic opportunity in a specific region of southern Ethiopia, is grounded in the principles of holistic, community-led development by Ethiopians for Ethiopians. Indeed, approaches we've discussed in previous models, such as user-centered design, participatory research, and community-driven assessments to find long-term systemic solutions, are fast gaining traction in the international development assistance landscape.
So after viewing this video, you are now able to fill out the next 2 pages of your workbook. And these are questions and charts which really help you refine and make your ultimate choice, going from a short list to a finalist when you're deciding which organizations to support. I should probably add here that some of the organizations I profile are NEED members, and for every organization that I mention, there are dozens and dozens more doing great work. So I'm certainly not endorsing one particular organization over another. These are organizations I'm familiar with who were kind enough to help me develop case studies. And I think they are good examples of best practice in the field, but they are by no means the only ones out there. And I would encourage you to do your own due diligence and to find your own rising stars in the space. So finally, we come to the last section of this workshop, and this is about overcoming some really destructive myths that plague the international development space. The first of these is the overhead myth. If I said to you, you should choose a wine based on how much the vineyard spent on insurance and advertising, this 2014 Merlot was produced with only 14% overhead, and this 2012 Zinfandel claims that only 5% goes to administrative costs, I'll go with the Zinfandel. You'd think I was crazy. Yet this is how the vast majority of Americans judge charities. In fact, 80% of Americans will reduce their support or stop giving to charities whose administrative costs appear too high. Most don't know overhead means rent, utilities, insurance, marketing and communications, fundraising, office supplies, HR technology. In other words, all the infrastructure and systems needed to serve people and execute their mission. Some of this is legally required, like insurance, bookkeeping, and accounting. Some just has to be done, like program evaluation and grant reporting. But the public often equates overhead with only salaries and believes that people working in the nonprofit sector should work for low pay. Well, guess what? They do. 2/3 of all charities have budgets under $500,000, $500,000, and the average CEO's salary nationally in the US is $64,000. The bigger salaries at the end of this chart are mostly for universities and hospitals. Nonprofit work is just as, if not more, complex as any other business, with the added need to fundraise. Yet there's a misperception that charities should spend 15% of their budget to cover overhead and not more. In reality, that number could be anywhere between 21% and 89%, depending on where the charity is located, which populations it's serving, and the nature of its work. Since there's no standard definition of what constitutes overhead, some charities just lower their overhead ratio using expense allocation tricks. Others play the game by boldly displaying an overhead ratio on their website or annual report, rather than show how infrastructure investment increases their impact. Charities have trained themselves to not ask for enough money. Rating websites such as Charity Navigator perpetuate this starvation cycle by awarding stars based primarily on overhead ratios. So donors keep basing their decisions on this flawed metric because no one's giving them a better tool. Let's be clear. Overhead figures do not measure effectiveness or efficiency. Low overhead is not a proxy for impact. The more you focus on overhead, the more you force charities to waste their time trying to reduce costs to dangerously low levels instead of developing strong programs. So focus on the quality of their programs and the value they add to the community. There was an interesting article in Bridgespan a few weeks ago that shows that this is also happening on the international scene. This is a chart of Indian NGOs showing you that overhead costs can be as high as 51%, and that this misnomer that no more than 15% overhead is appropriate is really harmful, particularly in the advocacy and policy space that we were talking about earlier. In fact, some of the best ways to have impact is to support capacity building for an organization you admire, which is doing good work. For example, by paying the registration fee for the chief executive to attend an important conference. The effect of that gesture may be multiplied many times over. The second destructive myth is one I call impact per dollar. And here's a short video about it.
Mythbuster, impact per dollar. Let's say homeless shelter A provides people with 5,000 nights of shelter each year, and its total program cost is $50,000, so $10 per night per person. Shelter B provides 2,000 nights of shelter for $40,000 a year, so $20 per night per person. Is Shelter A twice as effective as Shelter B? No. But unfortunately, many people think a charity's effectiveness should be measured by the impact per dollar. Here's why it doesn't work. First of all, you know that nights of shelter is not impact. It's an output. And only some types of charities provide easily measurable outputs. But what about those that focus on advocacy, systems change, civic engagement, or capacity building? Measuring only a charity's direct service work instead of measuring all its strategies holistically is misleading. Second, location makes a huge difference to the cost of programs. Third, and very importantly, impact per dollar does not measure long-term outcomes. $10 may provide a shelter for one person for one night, but what does that actually do for this person in the long run? Are the people served by Shelter B less likely to experience homelessness in the future, even if their night costs twice as much as in Shelter A? Cheaper does not necessarily mean better. Also, impact per dollar fails to take equity into account. People from marginalized backgrounds often require more specialized services, such as translation, transportation, or childcare. If you look only at impact per dollar, the organizations serving marginalized people will seem less efficient and thus less effective, which means donors will give less to them. Another common misleading statement you often see is, just $15 will provide a child with a hot school lunch for a year. Sorry, but there's no possible way to make this calculation. All programs require many inputs and many players working together to get anything done. Impact per dollar fails to measure the real costs of programs. It gives inaccurate information while giving the illusion of accuracy, and it turns marginalized people into transactional economic units, which only further dehumanizes them. But many charities realize that donors want quick, simple answers, preferably one number. By perpetuating this practice, they actually encourage donors to be complacent. If $15 will solve a complex, entrenched issue like hunger, why bother with more? You cannot distill people's lives, their worth, their suffering with a simple number. This approach to evaluating effectiveness is forcing charities to compete with each other for ratings. A better way for Shelter A to present its accomplishments would be, your support, along with all of us working together, helped us serve 5,000 people this year.
And finally, we'll end talking about silver bullets. These are new approaches or concepts that take the international development world by storm, but inevitably either fail or produce unintended consequences. Three famous ones are play pumps, one laptop per child, and even microfinance, which for a time was a darling of the international development community. Play pumps is a famous case study. The concept was of a merry-go-round powered by children that in turn powered a water pump that filled a tank on which advertising billboards could be displayed to provide revenue to maintain the pumps. The problem was that the merry-go-round actually required 27 hours a day of turning in order to pump up enough water, that the communities in which these merry-go-rounds were installed were too poor to attract advertisers, and that the merry-go-rounds and the pumps encountered huge maintenance issues. So a lot of high-profile donors ended up with egg on their faces. One laptop per child was another great and ambitious concept to put millions of laptops into the hands of children throughout the global south. And again, all sorts of unanticipated problems plagued the project. And even microcredit, which was so popular in the 1990s, has been somewhat discredited. Several reputable studies show no conclusive evidence that access to credit alone reduces poverty in the aggregate. The proliferation of microlenders has driven some households into a debt trap, especially when loans are used for consumption, not business investment. And although the majority of loans go to women, studies now show that in many places, sociocultural norms constrain women to low-earning, informal work. Today, financial inclusion is a much broader concept, helped by the huge advances made in technology. So I hope this has given you some sense of what a small donor can do to be a little bit more savvy and to have a little bit more impact. I think we can now go back to showing me live, and I can take some of your questions and discuss some of the comments that were made in the chat box. An interesting question, and please now feel free, there are no more videos, and it's question time, so feel free to post some questions. There was an interesting question of how you measure success when the work is capacity building or mentoring. And one important concept in measurement and evaluation, which I didn't address to save time, was that of qualitative and quantitative data. Qualitative data, which is stories, which we heard about in the keynote, storytelling, but the right kind of storytelling, is an incredibly important tool, particularly in the international assistance space. And that is probably the best way to see if a capacity building or mentoring program is making a difference. So it's something that I addressed in the video on how to look at a charity's website and analyze it critically. And it's a tool that you could use when hard data and measurement is less easily available, for example, a mentoring program. I do want to point out that the videos and the slides I've used today form the basis for a 3-hour virtual course that I've developed for need, which will be available this fall, which takes a donor from the most basic step of choosing a cause, deciding which issue area they're interested in, through to choosing an approach, understanding some of the concepts we discussed here today, which is whether to go for programs at the community level, whether to go for policy change, whether to harness market forces, through to understanding impact, how you select a short list, and what questions you ask of the organizations you want to support. There's also going to be a lot of information on international giving, on the mechanics of giving overseas, but all of this done from the perspective of a small or a mid-sized donor who is probably going to have to support existing organizations and is going to need basic information, but probably doesn't have the luxury of commissioning a study or sometimes even being able to engage directly with an organization due to distance or due to the fact that many organizations don't have the capacity to talk with smaller donors or to engage directly with them. So small and mid-sized donors have to rely on a different set of variables and do the best they can with publicly available information. And that's why I hope that this workshop has given you some tools and some ideas for how you, as a smaller donor, can use information that's publicly available and analyze it with a more critical eye and have a better sense of what you can do to have more impact and to be more satisfied. Another point I want to make is that this course will be available, of course, to need members, but also to organizations around the country and around the world who promote philanthropy. And so if you have enjoyed it and if you'd like to know more about it, please feel free to reach out through Need or directly to me. We are looking to build our network of partners who will provide their course to their members or their clients. So if you're part of a membership-based organization and think that clients or members of that organization might enjoy learning about how to become more effective, if you feel there's a need for this, please reach out to Need or reach out to me and let us know. I have an interesting question about how a small or mid-level donor can start their learning and how overwhelming it seems, how much information there's out there. And in the course, we will be addressing this issue. The course also comes with a resource hub, a place to turn for information. But really, I want to encourage people as they start on their giving journey, or even seasoned donors who are feeling a little bit frustrated, who feel they might not be having as much impact as they would like, and tell you that it's not brain surgery. It need not take hours and hours. 85% of American donors spend less than 2 hours a year doing any due diligence before they give. When you think about how much time people spend researching a restaurant or a vacation or a new car or an insurance policy, it's pretty shocking that they can write checks for thousands of dollars based maybe on the recommendation of friends or family, maybe on an event, a disaster, maybe on something that just struck their fancy, but that they don't apply the rigor and the time that they spend on in other areas. So if all you can do is spend as much time researching your next donation as you do finding a restaurant or a vacation place or a new insurance policy, that already puts you well ahead of the pack and means that you will be a much better informed and hopefully a much more satisfied donor. And the whole point of the course that I've developed with Need is to give you a framework to do that. It takes you step by step, and as you fill out your workbook, you end up with a personal roadmap for your giving. You end up with a plan. You end up feeling that you're relatively confident, you know what you're doing, and that is a real guarantee that you will feel satisfaction at the end of the process, and that you will really feel good about your giving. Unfortunately, a lot of donors, surveys are showing, even very wealthy donors are frustrated. They are not feeling that they can have the impact that they'd like to have. Of course, belonging to organizations like Need, which provide such a wealth of resources, so many opportunities to hear from experts, is fantastic, and Need is performing an absolutely vital role in the international assistance space. But there's an awful lot, even a small or mid-level donor who doesn't know a lot about an issue. There's an awful lot you can get just from a simple Google search, maybe subscribing to a publication like Alliance magazine, which is a good international philanthropy publication, or just keeping up to date on what's happening. You'll see it makes a huge difference. And as I was saying earlier, it's not brain surgery. It's perfectly accessible to everyone. Also, a lot of intermediary organizations do a good job keeping their donors, their members informed. A good charity communicates with its donors and sends them newsletters and sends them information. So it's relatively easy to get up to speed on issues, and it should not be daunting. It should not be what's keeping you from becoming involved in international giving, because the satisfaction you get is just immeasurable, and your dollar goes so much further. And now that the world is so interconnected, you're doing just as much good when you give overseas as you are when you just give in the US. A lot of people say to me, I don't know why I should be giving overseas when there's so many problems on my doorstep. But my response to that is that we really are a village, and the problems, the issues that need to be solved overseas are lapping right up on our shores, and the planet's too small now. We need to think about the planet in all its dimensions. So if there are no further questions, please feel free once again to consult the videos, to consult the slides again. We will let you know as soon as the NEED course comes out. And I will let you go a few minutes early, and please enjoy the rest of the afternoon. It will be a great learning experience to focus on the geographic areas that might be of interest to you. Thanks so much for joining me. Take care.